Hello and welcome to this. So my name is Dr. Rob Phillips. I'm a senior tutor of design features at the Royal College of Art. Today I'm going to be presenting some work from Ecological Citizens. This is a Network Plus, an EPSRC sponsored Network Plus project, and it is in collaboration between Royal College of Art, Wrexham University, Stockholm Environmental Institute based at the University of York and funded by the EPSRC. Our agenda is to explore what it means to create a sustainable digital society, grow areas of research for the benefit of the UK, identify research challenges, and support initial testing of ideas and kickstart collaborations. So we are operating akin to a funding council within the work that we are doing. We acknowledge that our work is also based on our funding remit, focusing on perspectives from the UK. We encourage many different voices, but we acknowledge and bound the work that we are in and existing within. So I think as we get started, we really want to think about, how we're looking within the context of futures. And there's a few pieces of framing that I would like to do as we talk about this work. First of all, is that we are, as a group, far more interested in the notion of preferable futures, looking towards societal end. We're not interested necessarily in consumer-orientated objectives. We believe there's a lot of good work in there, but actually there's a lot of nuances between the field that we're looking in ecological design, technologies, citizen science, and all of these processes and how they work together. And there's a lot of complexity. So I think when we start to look at it, we build on a couple of things at the moment. First of all is from what is to what if. So Rob Hopkins, one of the founding fathers of transition towns, really started to understand how we're looking at creating collective imagination. I think that's something that's really important with what we're doing in this work, but also how we're approaching this field. So we also believe that preferable futures should be transformative, tangible, community embedded, and providing everyone with better choices rather than dictating. I think quite often sustainable practices have been polarized good, bad, rather than going, actually, how can we enable people to make better choices? Because quite often there's this paradox and anomaly that the cheapest accessible food is actually the worst for us, essentially. And these things jar, and we need to explore them. So as we start to come into what is ecological citizens, we view citizenship as a practice, so it can be claimed and acted and performed. And I think that's really important. We're not talking about the boundaries laid down by governments. We're talking about how you can be a good citizen to those around you and the planet. And I think that is a continually evolving discussion with how that develops. We believe quite often within the team that governmental procedures are operating too slow. So we are operating and working within community contexts. So when we go into the next piece, there's two different forms so there's citizen design and ecological citizen design. They're two different things. Citizen design is about how things are opening. They are specific catalysts. They build on other people's work. They enable people. Whereas ecological citizen design is more about cultivating sustainable intent from the start. So it's more focused. And we've got a couple of examples for you to ground these. So the first one is a project on our radar, a really exciting group that started during the Ebola crisis. And what they were looking at is different communities, different groups were looking at how they could enable good citizen journalism to be enabled in remote places and remote locations, but while still having the robustness of all of their sources, all of their practices, so that they could, again, be broadcast and they have efficacy to them. So we view that as very much citizen design. It's very important, but it's not quite what we're doing. An example of ecological citizen design is the My Nature Watch project. So this was formerly an EPSRC project by myself and some colleagues at the Interaction Research Studio. And what this was is it was about making DIY trail cameras that then people could make and create a connection between themselves and the natural world through digital mediums. So the interesting thing over the course of the project was that people actually changed their environment and they changed their space as they were using these technologies. They were re-landscaping and becoming more responsive to what was happening in the world around them, which was pretty amazing. So there are these steps that we see within ecological citizenship, which is obviously towards citizenship, so mapping existing assets, looking to regenerative processes, looking at ecologically positive action, so how are we seeking a benefit for what are we doing? And an ideal world is moving towards collective autonomy, so where people are building off the back of the design and the design implementation that you're creating and the proposals to then move into a next stage. So again, we see this happening within many, many different ways. And it's part of our remit as an EPSRC Network Plus to help cultivating this. So please keep an eye on our work online as well, because we're starting to launch our projects. And I think this idea that's really interesting is when you start to create autonomy actually within the communities that you're working with, a designer's role changes. And I think that's a really important discussion point, especially within this track, because what should it look like? How should it enable? How should it change? So here we seek to unpack climate futures, the opportunities, benefits, and pitfalls, and we do that within the paper. So please have a look there. But we see ecological citizenship as a lens to really go deeper into this work. So earlier in the year, we hosted a roundtable with leading partners listed down the right-hand side. We started to create narratives from this roundtable and started to actually think about the biggest challenge that we have within this work is that all of these systems and processes are so interconnected that it's very difficult to design in isolation. So, for example, we use words like design proposition rather than problem solution, right? Because you're dictating that people are the problem and this is the solution, rather than going, hey, we've got a proposal, how would this work in this place? And so I think there are so many different things. One of the points that we started to look at was what would a material passport look like from everything through the construction industry, how we're purchasing, how we're planning, how we're looking at circular economies. And I think these things start to become, again, really interesting when you start to look at place-based design, when you look at the fact that we need to harvest materials from a more immediate surroundings, import, export. How does this change? How do we move towards these common practices? And again, there are more detailed elements in the paper. So within this notion of collective autonomy, also, how do you open up these different spaces? So throughout all of these illustrations, these were really simple, straightforward touch points that we were starting to look at. We were starting to go, actually, how do we work with data? How do we start to work with understanding materials usage? How do we map it? How do we map bigger spaces? How do we look at biodiversity so that people can have a greater connection with what their impact is and what's actually happening around them? unfortunately, for many things within climate change, we're at such a distance from some of those impacts that we realize these things too late. So how does that become more embedded in our day-to-day lives? How do we work with councils? How do we work with all these different groups? I think it's really important. These key interested parties, we're negotiating so many elements that, like, how do we put the citizen voice front and center? How do we empower people? And I think that's really important. As soon as you start to design, we need to become so much more aware of the power dynamics of what we're doing. There's so much complexity. What we're looking at, how we're doing it. For example, Ash Dieback, how we're capturing data on it, how we're working within this field. Who's responsible for that? How does that start to become to be shared? And I think as soon as you start to empower communities, we need to think about what we leave behind. And that's a core question that I'd love in the Q&A. I think within all of the findings and the narratives, the roundtable was exceptionally busy, and that's why we distilled into these narratives that we're presenting in the paper, mainly because actually we really need to think about lifelong learning, intergenerational learning, and kind of how we're all citizens based in organizations or places or in schools. Also, how we should not be at the center. Like, how are we working in harmony? We live within nature. Wildlife should still be wild. What does it mean to work within these places? How does it work? How long should it be working for? How do we design for exit? What are the materials that we leave behind? I think these things they're core questions, but we're liable. We really need to break these things down into far easier transition points. I think within this, we need to support, rather than leading with a stick, we need to lead with a carrot and support positive behavior. And we need to start to think about how these different spaces can work. I think with all of the propositions that we're presenting today and within the paper, these are concepts. They won't work everywhere. I think it's very dangerous to do that. We're interested in how you can start to look at place-based propositions and how to devolve them and how to explore that over a wider sense of time. And I think, some of the core themes that are coming out of it, our government in the UK it's really reliant on the voluntary sector, which is mind-blowing, and it's amazing. But there's a certain demographic. It's people who are time rich. It's not everybody. And so how do we enable these groups? I think, again, lastly, when we start to look at really specific things, for example, our water usage, right? Okay, well, what happens when we start to look at preferable futures where we're only allowed so much? Or how is this regulated? Or how is this behave? What happens if you travel for work? How do you have enough? How do you share it? What about hotels? Like all of these, where do you stay? How do you share it with friends? What happens when you have families? These things shouldn't happen top down. They should be place-based. But I think some of these common threads are really important to unpack. So future work and future tools that we're doing, obviously the conclusions are in the paper. We wrote this as a provocation, as a position to ask questions. But what are the tools and infrastructures required to offer autonomy? And I think that's something that is a 3-year project in itself. And it requires a bit of unpacking. So it's like, how are you trying to enable people? How are you trying to map and connect people? I think also going well beyond the voluntary sector, we shouldn't be doing these things as volunteers. This is part of our job. This is part of our job as being a citizen. The same way that you would, if your children or your friends' children, they came around to dinner, you would be seen to take care of those kids as your own. Why? Because it's what you should be doing. And so how we are, like almost what's our moral compass? What do we believe? How do we build these things? I think is really good to question, but we shouldn't necessarily just be looking at financial motivations. We should be looking at how we want to create that together, but they should be affordable and accessible to all. And for people that can't afford to donate that time, how are they remunerated? Because we all have skills, we all have benefit, but some people haven't had the time to execute those skills. They shouldn't be persecuted against. I think that's really important. So thank you very much for your time today. I know this is a very broad picture of what we are presenting, but I think as soon as we start to go, how are we looking at preferable futures for ecological citizens? How are we navigating that? We can get to a really interesting discussion and start to see interventions pointing towards a sustainable digital society. Thank you for your time.